DevilNeverCry.
Not only did Square Enix answer our prayers and listen to our feedback, they've also announced some pretty interesting details in regards to PC ports and DLC. For those of you who aren't keeping up to speed or up to date on Final Fantasy XVI, a recent panel occurred, I believe, at PAX, in which they went over a plethora of details that would be included in Final Fantasy XVI's next patch, which coincidentally went live today. And so in this video, I kinda want to pick apart the patch, go over a few of the headline changes or additions that they've made, and of course discuss how they've actually included some fan feedback into this patch, and why that is a good thing. If you want to keep up to date on all things Final Fantasy XVI and 7 Rebirth and beyond, definitely subscribe as there's more content on the way. With that said and done though, let's dive in. The first major addition that comes along with patch 1.001 is the inclusion of new outfits for Clive, Jill, and Torgal. Perhaps you were sick and tired of seeing Clive's almost bare naked chest bound in tight leather. Variety is the spice of life, as they say, and as of this patch, you'll be able to change out the outfits for each of these characters whenever you choose to. To coincide with the inclusion of these new outfits, they've also introduced a Glamor system for Clive's swords. Essentially, you'll be able to use the statistics of whatever weapon that you currently wield, perhaps one that might be super strong, but then you'll be able to choose what your weapon looks like, allowing you to perhaps use your favorite weapon's appearance without having to worry about whether or not statistically it will be viable for combat. This particular feature can be seen in several other RPGs and MMOs, and whilst it's not groundbreaking, it is a welcome addition. I can just imagine Ultima, the final boss, getting his ass handed to him with Clive using nothing but a base sword, wondering what exactly is going on. Alongside these 3 new additions, they've also made some changes to the gameplay that should make your experience a whole lot smoother. The first of which is actually reducing the amount of time after you pull off a successful parry, in which you can activate iconic abilities as a reprisal. I guess the initial window must have been slightly too large, not necessarily something I've seen people complain about, but definitely something people have taken advantage of, I guess, when stacking up damage. This next change should please some of you combo fanatics. They've actually increased the time that small enemies remain vulnerable in mid-air to follow-up attacks after being launched, essentially allowing you to combo enemies in the air a whole lot easier. Perhaps this change was put in motion from some feedback that they must have gotten. I imagine that there were people who complained about the fact that after launching some enemies, that they weren't vulnerable for long enough before they were actually able to get to them and start their attacks. Beyond these few changes, in this new patch you'll now actually be able to see your ability cooldown times in the abilities menu when you look at the details for said ability, including information also on how those cooldown times are affected by any of your currently equipped accessories. I'll chalk this up as another small quality of life addition. It definitely would have been nice to know numerically what those cooldown times were when initially playing, but I could make do without them. To wrap up the gameplay side of things, they've also made a few changes to the Adate Stone's Hall of Virtue, aka the training mode, where they've added a few different options to help you modify Torgal's behavior in combat, alongside also adding the option to restart with the original settings. And with the new additions and the gameplay aside, let's talk about what, at least for me, is one of the biggest changes that they could have made, and this pertains to the arcade mode. In a video that I made last week, which I'll leave a link to on the screen somewhere here, I effectively went over all of the current issues that have been surmised by the community in regards to arcade mode, and why for a lot of people it may not necessarily be all too much fun, especially going for those higher ranks on those harder difficulties. To be honest, even going further back than that, I believe in the launch month for Final Fantasy XVI, I'd actually offered up a video featuring some constructive criticism for Final Fantasy XVI's arcade mode, and included some feedback as to how they might change the arcade mode, or fix it, so to speak, to make it more enjoyable overall. And funnily enough, when looking at the comments section for the videos in which I talked about arcade mode, a lot of you shared similar sentiments in regards to the frustrations with arcade mode and how things might be fixed. And with this new patch, I am happy to say that they have actually taken into account some of the feedback that has been put forward. Specifically, they will now be adding a time limit to each arcade mode stage, where they state that this change is intended to correct an issue wherein certain abilities could be used to continuously amass points over time, allowing for scores greater than first envisioned. You can indeed continue to play as normal after the time limit is exceeded, but any further actions will not add to your score. And there we have the proverbial bombshell. You'll no longer be able to sit in Ultimaniac arcade mode for almost hours at a time, farming points to get those S ranks. Moving forward, time will be a major factor that you have to take into account when going for those S ranks, as if you sit around too long effectively trying to farm points out of enemies, you can end up screwing yourself out of the S rank entirely. Adding a time limit was one of those things that I'd mentioned several times, and personally I'm glad to see that Square Enix are taking into account not just my own feedback, but the feedback of several other people out there. It was the simplest fix that they could go for, and quite honestly I don't know what other alternatives there would be without having to rework the entire system. Also, on the topic of arcade mode, they've also mentioned that they've reduced the scores that have been awarded specifically by the rhyme and gouge abilities, and that in this update and in future updates, they'll be planning to adjust the scoring system in order to reward the creative chaining of multiple abilities, ultimately allowing a continuous assessment of how scores in arcade mode are calculated so that they'll be able to maintain a consistent challenge throughout. Quite a meandering and lengthy way to essentially state that they'll be keeping an eye out on the leaderboards for arcade mode and the prevailing strategies to ensure that things don't get too easy or that exploits aren't essentially abused. And with those changes implemented, done and dusted, we come to the major announcement that was unveiled last night. Square Enix are indeed working on 2 premium DLC expansions for Final Fantasy XVI. By premium, they mean paid DLC, which essentially means that there'll be substantial pieces of DLC that fans can sink their teeth into. As soon as this was announced, I pretty much was racking my brain trying to figure out what angle they take with this DLC. Would they take the Final Fantasy XV approach, where they would dedicate one entire piece of DLC to one character and their exploits that we might not have seen in the main game? Things like Episode Sidolphus or even Episode Jill, for example. There's plenty of pieces of the story that are left untold or up to the player's imagination, which would be cool to see and essentially play through as we tackle the game through the eyes of another character. Or perhaps is this the perfect time for Leviathan the Lost to make their reappearance, or perhaps for us to understand and find out why exactly they were lost in the first place and why they didn't appear in the main story. After all, Ultima continuously refers to Clive or Muthos as the perfect vessel, despite the fact that Clive didn't actually absorb all of the powers of all of the available icons and is missing the powers of Leviathan. There's lots to contemplate and speculate about, but I am interested in hearing your theories, so let me know down in the comments below what you think these new pieces of DLC will focus on. To the surprise of absolutely no one but the applause of many, Final Fantasy XVI was confirmed to be receiving a PC port with more details to follow soon. Anecdotally, I know a few people who've wanted to try Final Fantasy XVI but couldn't thanks to not owning a PS5, so I'm sure they'll be glad to hear about the impending PC release. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.